Hello, and welcome to another episode of Community Conversations, the podcast for those who have a heart for helping others. In this episode, Pietro is speaking with Robert Sams, the Executive Director and a volunteer crisis supporter for Lifeline Newcastle and Central Coast. If you work in community services or find yourself as the accidental counsellor, there'll be something in this podcast for you. That said, people reach out to Lifeline when they're not feeling at their best. So if you've stumbled on the podcast today and not feeling great, we encourage you to skip the podcast for now and reach out to Lifeline on 13 11 14 or SMS 0477 13 11 14. Now, to unpack all the things you didn't know or need to know about Lifeline, it's over to you, Pietro.
Well, welcome to the podcast, Robert. It's great to have you on the program. We like to ask all of our guests about their heart for helping others. So as the Executive Director for Lifeline, you obviously have a heart for helping others. Can you tell our listeners, where did your heart for the community come from?
It's a great question and great to chat, guys. I think, that heart, it's hard to put to one thing in life, but I remember spending quite a bit of time with Graham Long, who ran the Wayside Chapel in Sydney for some time. And Graham famously taught me, really, when he said that there's no such thing as a single human being. The minimum unit is two. And, I think that resonated so strongly with me that, it is human connection. It is being with others in whatever form that is. That really is at the heart of who we are as human beings. And I think, that drives me in my work. It's around how I live my life, and really being and connecting with others is at the heart of it.
What exactly, though, does Lifeline do?
Most people know Lifeline from our national crisis support helpline, 13 11 14, and that's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for anybody. The simplest way I describe our service is that it's accessible, so it's there for everybody 24/7. It's non-discriminatory, so we're not a specialised service, but nor do we turn anyone away who calls into the service. And it's freely available, and you can call whenever you like about whatever you like. And people do. People will call in crisis, and that definition of crisis is their own. One of the things that we teach our crisis supporters is that every interaction is a new interaction. And even if someone may have called Lifeline before, that then today may be different, tonight might be different, next week might be different, and that's at the heart of it. So we meet people in where they are today when they call us. We've recently got a text service, so that's been up and running now for a little while, and that's an interesting one. I think that when I first learnt and heard about the text service, I thought, that's interesting. A lot of people like to connect person to person, and what's the text service going to be like? Well, I was pleasantly surprised when we did some research early on in the pilot of that with the University of Wollongong, and 42% of people who used the text service at that time said that they wouldn't have reached out to Lifeline otherwise. That tells me that we need to be there in a way that people seek our help, and that's really an interesting thing for us at Lifeline as we think about what does innovation mean and what does it really mean for those who seek our help. So, those two things, the digital service, what we call the digital services, the phone, the text, and we also have a chat service via our website as well. But I'd love to share with your listeners, particularly those in the Hunter and the Central Coast regions, a little bit about what we do in community as well, and that's lesser known. So people know the phone service. It's on the at the end of news stories and shows where people might have raised concerns. So people are really used to that. But what they might not know is locally we have face-to-face and video counselling. And just like the telephone service, that also is available and it's accessible and it's free of charge. And that service can be really, really important. And sorry, one other thing. When I say it's available, you can usually book an appointment for that within the next few days. So, if someone's needing or wanting to see a psychologist or some other mental health specialist but can't get in for 3 months or 4 months, and that's typical of the waits, then we can be there for them in that period and help them work through some of the things that are happening for them, and not to replace the need for psychologists, but to find that place in the mental health system where people don't go missing.
That is incredible, isn't it? I don't think many of our listeners, myself included, not aware that's 42% of your clientele have been texting through. So like we'd just text you and then you would text back, so the conversation would be just back and forth through a text message.
The really interesting thing, I think, our service is confidential. We don't need your Medicare card and your bank details, and we simply we answer the telephone. Hello, this is Lifeline. May we help you? And sometimes we might not. So that's the point. We are there for you when you want us. And the interesting thing about the text service is that, if you don't want to pick up the telephone, and we know plenty of people do, but for those who might not be able to, say that it could be somebody in a dangerous relationship or a violent relationship or a relationship where they can't necessarily make a phone call. You could be sitting watching a television show and texting Lifeline. You could be a kid in the playground who's feeling the pressure of bullying and text Lifeline, and no one necessarily would know because it remains confidential, obviously. But it's just a different forum for people to be able to reach out and contact us.
Let's read out that text number again. It's 0477 131114. Is that correct?
Yep, that's it. So it's the phone number with 0477 in front. That's the 131114 national number with the text number in front. So that's and it's available to people 24/7.
Well, my own producer was just sharing with me a few moments ago that his own daughter actually reached out to Lifeline on that text number. It was actually through her that we found out about it. So is the cohort of the 42% likely to be younger people?
That's a reasonable assumption for part of the cohort. Interestingly, we've found more recently that older people as well. And I think, as we've become more tech savvy and potentially, through COVID, where we've gotten used to and almost being forced to connect digitally in many ways, I think more and more people will find that as a comfortable medium and a medium that might suit their circumstances at the time, depending on where they're at. You could be on the bus traveling into work or the train and still feeling down or feeling, anxious or concerned. And, that might not be the environment to pick up the telephone, but it might be the environment to text and have a chat.
Yeah, and I think most of us are used to people, in a conversation, a coffee shop or wherever, just on their mobile devices, texting through. We don't know what they're doing. So that's a great service. I think it's brilliant. And I'd imagine the percentage rate would probably increase as people get to know about it. Hopefully through our Community Conversations podcast, people actually do that. Robert, men and women and children have all struggled to some degree whilst navigating through the past 18 months. What has been the leading cause for people to contact Lifeline?
Difficult to have one, but if sort of trying to lump it in, and probably not surprising, there's been various stages. I think initially people were really worried. We probably as a population didn't know what this virus was, and many of us hadn't lived through anything like a pandemic. So, I think in the early stages there was certainly worry about, is this going to kill people? What is the effect? Can I catch this virus? There's certainly, as we got into lockdown and, the real lockdown where people weren't traveling at all in those periods, and, isolation became certainly a theme where people were not able to reach out in ways or connect in ways that they were used to. Whether it was, like I said before, missing a commute to work or the coffee shop and the barista and the friends at work and family, etc. So, isolation was a strong theme for a while. With that came anxiousness, and I think as there was uncertainty, then that's a natural extension, is that people become really anxious around the uncertainty and how long is this going to last? And we've been in lockdown before, now we're back in, and the ins and outs, particularly people in Victoria where there was people were in and out. And then there was definitely another theme, and that theme was, I guess, frustration and anger, and various different causes for that. But you could hear people who were getting really frustrated as things went on, and fatigue. What lay behind that was many factors, but people definitely tired and fatigued, and they'd had enough.
Lifeline Australia posted to LinkedIn recently some national statistics about the demographics of people using your service and how they engage with Lifeline. Perhaps you could share, Robert, some statistics about the number of people who's been in contact with Newcastle or the Central Coast Service, including any ages, perhaps genders, and if there are pockets in the Newcastle Central Coast region where there's a high proportion of calls and where they might come from.
Look, it's challenging for us to break those stats down per region, and that's because of the confidential nature of the service. But I can tell you, certainly more women contact us than men, but men are reaching out. And, I know it's a particular interest for some of your listeners, the effects of suicide on men. And I think it can be challenging for men to reach out. And in many ways, we want to go to them. That's some of our community services. And I might come back to that later, particularly our aftercare program where we go to them. Men and women, but particularly men, I think is helpful to be reaching out, not just saying, hey, you reach out to us. But the reality is that we get calls from all walks of life. And whilst, those statistics are helpful, I guess, in many ways, what the reality is that depending on the circumstances, and we know that when certain events happen or certain people might talk on the television, for example, or events are portrayed or anniversaries of events, it can trigger different reasons for people to call the service. So, it really is a broad spectrum of people who call. And we do have some very younger people. We have people who call regularly because that's part of their self-care routine. It's part of their routine that they may have with a counsellor or a psychologist, is to ring us, on a certain day or at a certain time and just check in. And that for them is what they need, and that for them is what we provide at that time.
Can you tell me, Robert, why is it challenging for men to call? What do you find are the barriers for men, particularly, to make a phone call to Lifeline?
Stigma around mental health. There's been a bunch of work done on that in recent years, and some really, really important work. And I think, that work, needs to continue. You just look at the moment, we're recording this as we come out of November, for example, and, promoting men's health, not only mental health, but, prostate care, for example. But, I think it's a bit simplistic to say that men, they're the slackers and they don't call the doctor and they don't go, I'm a bloke. I don't mind admitting that, that's me at times.
Of course.
But, you have to ask the question of why, and I think that's what you asked, is the stigma associated with it. And, I think a shining light in this for me is Lifeline Australia's board chair for the last 12 years, John Brogden. And John talks openly about his challenges with mental health and his mental illness. And he talks openly about his attempt at suicide. So, what I'm saying here is something that John said several times publicly. And, I think one of there's two key messages I think that he talks about. One is that people talk of a lived experience of suicide. He talks of a living experience. He lives with it. He was at our AGM this year and he talks about it and says that, he still struggles on occasion. So it's him saying, I might be the chair of the board, I might be the CEO of an organisation, but I'm here to tell you that I struggle with it on occasions. And then the other thing that I think is just as critical, his wife Lucy, who's the chair of the National Mental Health Commission, he openly said this last week, that he talks about her as a carer. And I think there's something significantly important in John saying that his wife plays a role that cares for him. And saying that it's okay, that he's not okay sometimes. And there's many others like John, I think, but he's a great beacon, I think, of somebody who's well respected, and particularly in the business community, saying, we need to try and be more understanding. And mental illness is not something that people can necessarily turn off. So I think, stigma and people making judgment about that mental illness. And I think that's sometimes the hardest thing that crisis supporters on our line have to learn away from, have to unlearn, if you like, is that judgment around others.
Sorry, Robert, just coming back to the statistics again, is there something that you can share about our region here of Newcastle and the Central Coast in relation to what you've just shared in general about John and others just a few moments ago?
Yeah, I think, what I know is in the last, in a 12-month period, we just finished our sort of annual reporting period. We see about 3,500 people between the Hunter and Central Coast in our counselling service. And that's 3,500 people who've reached out for help. And that's limited, of course, by the number of volunteers and staff and paid counsellors we have as well. So, we know that the numbers that call in to Lifeline from our region are, representative of the rest of the country. And that number gradually from the period of the bushfires in 2019 and certainly ramped up in COVID, increased by about 25% in that period. So, before the bushfires, an average day, and this is every day, was 2,400 calls nationally.
Wow. That's a lot of people, isn't it?
That was a lot of people. Then when we hit COVID, and consistently since March 2020, we haven't gone under 3,000 a day. So that's a more than 25% increase. And then in August this year, when we were talking about breaking records, we broke it 5 times the most calls to Lifeline in a day in August 2021. And at the peak, it was 3,600 people called into the service. And so, when we think about statistics, I think that I always say this, on the one hand, you could look at that and go, that's 3,600 people in a day reaching out for help, and wow, isn't that tragic? And on the flip side of that, I think, isn't it wonderful, to the point about stigma, that people are reaching out, are saying, I really do want to connect with somebody. And often the crisis supporter is a great person to connect with, because they will meet you in a non-judgmental way. They will be empathetic, and they will be compassionate towards what's happening for you in that interaction.
That leads us to the next question, which is basically around funding. So how is Lifeline funded, and how can the community support this life-giving service?
It's a great question. So I think the easy way I answer that is we certainly are very grateful for funding received from all levels of government. So the federal government, the state governments, and local are very supportive. But here, I'll give you the example of the Hunter and Central Coast. That's very supportive in keeping our service going, but it's about 50% of our revenue, or less than 50% of our revenue if you take into account grants. Locally, so grants and etc., fundraising and our retail make up about 60% of our revenue. So that's a huge amount that we've got to work on, and our team work really hard every year to raise those funds. And this year, so just so we date stamp this podcast for those who might listen in the future, in November 2021, for the first 3 months of our financial year, most of our shops were shut in the region. So there's half of our revenue wiped out for a quarter of the year, and that's been tough. And we're sensible financially. We've managed things over the year. We've got some money saved in the bank for exactly these occasions. We've been grateful for schemes like JobKeeper, where we've been able to keep our staff on board, which has been really important to us. But the reality is, Pietro, is that we are always in need of funding. A great example, we've just now put on 30 additional crisis supporters in the region, and each of those crisis supporters cost around $3,500 to train, and as they're supervised into their crisis support work. So 30 times 3,500, there's about $100,000 that, quite frankly, right now we don't have. But we're not going to let that service down. We're committed to do it, and we took the punt and we said, let's get out there and we will run a Christmas campaign. So we're currently doing that, and if people are interested, jump onto our Facebook page is probably the best way. But it's a big part of the job, and a big, I wish every minute of my day was focused on providing services to people, but the reality is that there's a cost to doing that as well.
So that's $3,500 per person, and you've just put on 30 new people.
Yep.
Is that just here in the Hunter and the Central Coast? Is that across the Coast? Yep. Right now, some of our listeners might be listening to this program and thinking, you know what, I actually haven't been able to do much. I haven't been able to go to the Lifeline shops for a while. How can I donate money, or what would you suggest?
If you jump onto hunter.lifeline.org.au, and for those on the Central Coast, the same, it's centralcoast.lifeline.org.au. And you can donate easily on the web page. There's a donate page there, or jump onto our socials and you'll see our current Christmas campaign, because we are determined more than ever. There's two reasons, or there's many reasons why we've just recruited people. One is because the demand is not decreasing; it's continuing. Secondly, to support that demand, we need crisis supporters. And we also want to look after our own crisis supporters who, not surprisingly, have been through everything we've been through in the last 2 years as well, and getting a bit tired and fatigued. And, even more so because they're talking to people about it regularly, and listening. And there can be a lot to take on board. So part of looking after our team is making sure that we've got new people coming in all the time, so that we're looking out for those who are there for us now.
So tell me, Robert, what's the breakup between staff and volunteers here on the Hunter and the Central Coast?
Yeah, overall the number is about 70-30-ish, 70% volunteers, and that's right across our crisis support service and our retail shops, and 30% paid staff. And those paid staff, many of those are supporting the crisis supporters, so they're doing their supervision and their professional development and coaching people after a call or during a call as part of their development, because we're dealing at times with high risk situations, so it's really important that we maintain development. You can't just learn the service and then jump on the phones and that's it. We really need to connect, check in with how it's landing for our crisis supporters, what's happening for them, and what are their experiences as well.
Just a question regarding key performance indicators. That's obviously a corporate kind of terminology that we face, or return on investment.
Yep.
With so many people contacting Lifeline, as you mentioned before,
yep,
how do you as the executive director measure success?
I can answer that in a few ways, and I think first of all, it's a really important question. For those of you, as you said, listeners who might want to support us, they need to know that support has been, that money being donated is being managed responsibly. So I think there's a few ways to measure that. So, we are about being able to meet as many people as possible who call us on the telephone service. So we measure our call answer rate nationally. And to give you an idea, we have increased that, and we reported this in the Lifeline Australia annual report this year, from 80% to 90% over the last couple of years. So 80% of 900,000 people nationally a couple of years ago to 90% of 1.1 million in the last 12 months. So we're very accountable to that. We also take qualitative measures. So for our counselling service, for example, we ask people how they've experienced the service. We ask them, we use a range of psychological scales. So for example, the depression and anxiety scale. So how are they feeling when they first came into the service, and is it making a difference? And I haven't talked yet about our community aftercare program, which is supporting people in community, in regions in the Hunter. It's very much about those kind of measures, but it's also about being accountable. We have the University of New England doing a formal evaluation on that service. So that's where independent people will talk to the users of that service, the people that are there, and ask them how the experience was for them.
I understand Lifeline offering training courses.
Mm-hmm.
I've been a participant in the past. Could you tell our listeners about some of the courses and who would normally be involved in being participants of those courses?
There's a few key courses. I mean, we run about 12 or so, and I won't talk you through all, but just some of the key ones. And I think, first of all, I think you mentioned before, accidental counsellor is kind of a cornerstone to what we provide. And it's providing the skills, the very basic skills that we learn in crisis support around, listening in a non-judgmental way. It's around, the skills around active listening and reflective listening, some of the very critical parts about a counselling. So accidental counsellor teaches you to really, if I could put it simply, be present to people and be there for their needs and attend to their feelings. We do training also in suicide awareness and intervention. So we run a program developed by Living Works called Safe Talk. It's a half-day program, and that teaches people to listen out for the signs, or we call them the cues, that somebody may be having thoughts of suicide, and importantly then getting them to help. And critically, the other really flagship of suicide prevention and intervention is ASSIST, which is applied suicide intervention skills training. And that really is, it's a pretty intense 2-day training program that will help people develop the skills to have a conversation and to provide an intervention where someone is having, when asked the question, are you having thoughts of suicide? The answer is yes.
We've got a lot of our listeners, Robert, as you can appreciate, working in the community sector, hence the reason why we're called Community Conversations. Self-care is very important. It's vital, actually. So for those that are caring for others, could you share maybe 5 tips on how workers can better look after themselves?
I'll try to do 5. Let's
start with 3 and we'll see how we go after 3. Yeah.
I think you've heard about my accounting skills. No, I think the very first thing that comes to mind when we talk about self-care, must be self-awareness. Knowing in ourselves what kind of things might be triggering or troubling us, and I think that's often overrated, or we overrate ourselves, thinking we're doing fine, thank you very much. And I think when we can ask or be honest with ourselves about how we're occurring to others, or how something might be occurring to us. So I think that self-awareness is critical. I think, you talked about, I guess the term they use is compassion fatigue. And I think, we can't be on all the time. And I see that so often in the sector more broadly, the helping sector, if you like, whether that be a social worker, an alcohol and drug counsellor, or whatever it might be. I think, I think a critical role I have as a leader is to help people share conversations about how they're doing, and how that that caring that they're giving of so much of themselves to others, how that's affecting them. So I think that's a really important one to look out for. I think the other thing is, I'll describe this, I think is I'm going to call it boundaries, of course.
Boundaries.
The key in the sector. But one of the things that I think of with COVID, early on in COVID, I was talking with one of my colleagues in Sydney who regularly commuted to work, 45 minutes an hour on the train and back in the afternoon. And I know that he was missing that. And in particular, you'll be pleased to hear he was missing listening to podcasts.
Yeah.
That was his downtime between work. That was what he did. And so, trying to think practically for you guys, what did he do? He said, I'm working longer at home. This is the peak of the start of the pandemic, etc. We're really busy. And he said, I'm going to create my own commute. So he said, when I'm decided I'm finishing work, I'm going to say to the family, I'm going to go for a walk for 20 minutes and 30 minutes. I'm going to get my podcast hit. And when I come home, I'm the same as walking in from the train or the bus or whatever. And so I think, how do we find those moments where we can put boundaries and be firm on those boundaries? I think that's a really important thing around when, I'll give you a great practical example. When I first started in this role, and somebody would ring me and say, hey, I've got a mate who I'm worried about, would you mind taking a call? And I would say more often than not, yes. And then I realised, that call usually was at 7 or 8 o'clock at night. That was interrupting family time, which, my dear loving wife is fine. She's a counsellor herself, so say no more.
Of course.
But I found that that was me, not creating boundaries, not allowing that space. So it was like, actually, I think the best thing I can advise that person to do is call the service. That's what it's there for. And that was not me not caring. It was me, to your point around self-care, I think.
So these tips that you've shared with us, with our audience, our listening audience, these are obviously skills and recommendations that you would provide for your own staff, so that they are actually setting boundaries, so they're actually monitoring their own triggers as well.
And I don't mind saying, I think as the leader in the organisation, they are things that I try very hard to do myself. I think this is not something we ought to, as leaders, just throw out there and talk about it like a textbook. It's actually something we've got to do. We've got to lead. And if we're not doing that, then I can't expect others to.
A very similar question to the previous one, but from the perspective of family and friends. I'll just share a quick story with you, Robert, just to illustrate. I had a friend of mine last year who took his own life. He moved interstate and I couldn't get to see him and I couldn't help him. Now, could you share some tips for people who don't work in the sector to recognise the signs of people who are serious about taking their own life, and how we might be able to intervene?
Yeah, we talked before about why men in particular and why people might not share that they're having concerns. And I think the first thing is it's a great privilege when someone shares that with you. And, with that privilege can feel like a real responsibility. So the first thing I want to say is, it can feel quite heavy and it can feel quite hard. But I think assured that, when people tell us or give us cues, and I can talk about those, that they're having thoughts of suicide, it really is a privilege to listen to that and to support and to help. And I think some of the cues, and some of them can be more subtle and some more obvious, but obvious changes in behaviour, where they're previously not so tidy and they're all of a sudden very tired, or tidy, sorry, or people might all of a sudden get their affairs into shape, and you think, well, that's not usual, or display different, obviously very different behaviours to what they might do. They're normally quite sad and they're feeling relieved. And people who are thinking of taking their life or who have attempted that I've talked to have said, there's a great relief sometimes when they've made a decision to take their life, and that is around not necessarily dying, which might be surprising. It's about finally, hopefully, that burden or the pain that they might be feeling goes. And a lot of people that we talk to who've attempted suicide say that's what they want to go, not necessarily their life. They want the feeling of being a burden to go. So I think if you are hearing that in people, it's, when I described it's a great privilege before and responsibility, I think at the same time, you don't have to be a doctor or a psychologist or a mental health professional. In fact, I think it's really important, nor a lifeline crisis supporter. I think it's really important that each of us in community are there for people when they need it. I talked before about people can reach out for help, but I really think as a community, if we're going to tackle suicide, the help needs to be there in our mates, in our family, in our friends and neighbours. And I, encourage people to reach out for some of the training we and other organisations run, so that they can, really listen for those cues. And then the really, really, really important tip, and it's probably the key one, if you are having any worry about somebody who's might be having thoughts of taking their life, and I've got to say, sometimes it's the hardest thing to learn on the telephone, is to actually ask the direct question to somebody: are you having thoughts of suicide? Are you thinking of taking your own life? Don't beat around the bush with it. Be really clear in that. And if you're worried that people might be offended or might be worried, that the overwhelming research says asking that direct question, one, does not induce thoughts of suicide that weren't there already. So some people worrying, am I going to put the thoughts into somebody's mind? The answer overwhelmingly is no. And two, what better sign that you care for someone than to be directly asking that question?
In the month of November, we've had International Men's Day, which was on November the 19th.
Mm-hmm. And
November is also the month that we talk about men's health, suicide prevention, prostate cancer. You mentioned before, Robert, testicular cancer. And many men just grow moustaches for the month of November to help raise funds for charities just like yours. So if we're talking about men's health, what are some of the leading concerns that you're aware of as it relates to perhaps me?
I think, we've probably touched on already, I guess, the stigma around any maybe ill health. That stigma, I think, particularly in men, is that, that we'd be right, mate, we can get through it. And of course, I think, I do think that that's a challenge, particularly for suicide, where it can be really challenging to say that I'm having these thoughts. It can be challenging to say I'm not coping really well, which is why, I think people like John I mentioned before saying, I'm talking about it, it's affected me. But I think, men, I think we are getting better. I just want to give I think the message is we are getting better as a society. We are, we've had good, significant awareness raising campaigns like Movember, where, mates are talking to mates, where we're making it all right to have a chat, where we're making it mainstream and normal now to ask, are you okay? And, and hopefully that comes from a position of, I really care about you, mate. And I think, no matter what the question you ask, are you okay, or how's things going? I think asking good open questions and encouraging conversation for any matter of men's health, whether that is the physical illnesses and cancers that ripen men, or it's mental health.
It's about being proactive. It's about hearing the signs. It's about when you said before a moment ago about my friend actually was getting his affairs into shape. That information would have been very helpful 12 months ago. You know what I mean? So those sorts of things are really important. Robert, in a recent podcast, one of our guests actually stated 400 young men killed themselves during the pandemic. Does this sound about right to you?
There's more than 3,000 people take their lives in Australia every year, and I think the fact that, and when we talk about hope and freedom, can be a really can be a place of no hope and no freedom, and sometimes limited connection and definitely isolation. So yes, I'm not surprised, and I'm concerned. On one hand, I'm concerned about the number of young people who are reported in suicide statistics generally. But on the other hand, I'm also hopeful. I'm hearing as a society that we want to talk more. I'm grateful that we've got our text service that makes it more accessible. There's services like Headspace that is designed just for young people. There's research organisations like Origin who are doing research just for young people. And I think as a parent myself, I'm really energised and have a sense of hope as well, that we are listening and we are going to be, as a society, putting plans in place that will be specifically for young people.
What are the suicide rates, especially amongst men in Australia, and what do you think we can do to stop these young men killing themselves?
I mean, there's no doubt that men are overrepresented in the numbers, and about 3/4 of those who die by suicide. And interestingly, and this is maybe another podcast in itself, but the number of people who attempt to take their life, that women attempt more and men end up taking their life in terms of the statistics. I think it's a really fascinating question that certainly has no one answer to, why people take their life. It's usually compounding. There's a number of factors. There may be one thing that might trigger an action, a relationship breakup, a financial concern. But I think what we need to do, and this is, right back at the very start, I said, I think we're a society that is built around connection. I think, there are so many things in our society today that lead us to individualism, to lead us to think about ourselves and what's important for us, which is important. We talked about self-care. I absolutely accept that. But, how do we connect? And because I think when we do have that true connection with neighbours, friends, family, Lifeline, if that's what's needed, then, it is that connection that actually, I think is one of the real critical suicide prevention strategies.
Many of us now around New South Wales in particular have been able to get about our business with obviously restrictions away from the lockdown, and hopefully we can start to rebuild connections together. Which would be obviously something that we're all looking forward to. With the rates of suicide, what are the statistics around, say, women and children? Have you got any details around that at all?
I can't give you a breakdown of the number of young people, but one of the training programs I'm really proud that our organisation has been a part of is a program on the Central Coast called Save Our Kids from Suicide, and it's a program that teaches senior school kids, parents and teachers alike in those suicide prevention training programs I mentioned earlier, so that they're all, kids are having conversations with each other. Kids are being able to go to Mrs. Smith and say, I'm worried about my friend Mary, or whatever it is. And I think so, that's the real time prevention activities that I think we can do for that group of people.
So we're about to Save Our Kids from Suicide being rolled out, being presented. Yep.
So it's this year, in fact, in early December, we'll celebrate 10 years of it running right across the Central Coast. And, I've got to pay credit to a bunch of blokes from North Gosford Rotary who have been at the heart of that. And they really have taken that as a passion to to raise funds. They're not doing the training. They're saying our job's to raise the funds. That's what we're good at, and our guys go in and support the training. But it's a real community approach to it. It's everyone coming together. We run training programs in sporting clubs, for example. It's because we know that the coach in a sporting club can often be a really influential person or someone that people turn to. So it's important that they know the skills as well.
You mentioned earlier in our program, Robert, that you've got 30 new volunteers. My question is, what would you say to anyone who's listening to our podcast today, who might want to be a Lifeline counsellor? What's the process?
The process is, as it should be, is quite detailed. There's about 90 hours worth of e-learning and training face to face. A lot of role plays, a lot of the heart and at the start of the training is getting to know ourselves, because for some people they might think that that's what they want to do, but as they learn more about themselves, realise it either might not be the right time for them or might not be for them at all. So that's really important that's recognised early. But there's the easiest way to answer that. There's three things we look for, attributes in a crisis supporter, and they're probably not surprising. One is empathy, and the way I describe that is that some people say walk in other people's shoes. I just say recognise there's other shoes that are there and recognise it.
That's very good. Very good. Yeah.
I think it's hard to walk in other people's shoes, but recognise there's shoes more than our own. Using that metaphor, there's compassion, which I looked that word up recently, and at the root of it says that it means in Latin suffer together, and I think that's about sitting alongside somebody, not taking that pain from them and saying I need you to be without pain. It's actually saying you're in pain, I'm sitting here with you. And I'm not going to shy away from it. And it's okay that you feel in pain, because I think, the biggest mistake we could make is that we want to take people's pain away from them. Instead, we're saying we're here with you in the pain. And the last attribute is self-awareness. And I think, I've talked about that already. It's about, who we are and what we bring to the conversation.
Robert, 90 hours is a long time for e-learning. Are there people that don't make it, that don't get through the training, and they're vetted out as being potential counsellors?
So just to clarify, so that's e-learning and classroom training as well, or via Zoom. But yes, people do opt out. We also do quite a detailed interview up front where we share with people what to expect. It's only fair and it's important that people know what they're up for. So, we spend a lot of time making sure that this isn't just having a chat to someone on a Friday afternoon or a Monday morning. There are 30% of our calls relate in some way or another to suicide, and every single day across Australia we develop 120 safety plans. So that's when the answer to the question of are you having thoughts of suicide is yes, and then we help that person in a way that works for them to develop their own safety plan.
What does a safety plan look like, Robert?
Our key question is, how do we keep you safe for now? And what does it mean for you to be kept safe in that moment? And part of the plan might be that we call back Lifeline tomorrow. Part of the plan might be that they agree that they change the environment they're in. They go from wherever they are to somewhere that might feel safer. They may decide that, they could have had a few drinks and they're going to put the keys down or something like that. So it really is about talking through what works for them.
But earlier you mentioned about unlearned bias. How do people learn that, unlearned bias?
That's a real good question, I think. The really interesting thing about my role, I love that I can be the executive director by day, so to speak. And then when I train to be a crisis supporter, I'm sitting there as an equal, and I'm open to the questions that people ask me. I'm open to the reflective questions. And when they say, when we do a role play and there's a critique, I'm really open to what's been shared with me. And I think, that's the key. We are all continuing to learn. I don't think anyone's the perfect crisis supporter. We learn through every interaction. It's why both reflective practice with your supervisor and group supervision, where we share our experiences with each other, are a critical part of the service, so that we can continue to ask ourselves questions and wonder what happened there, or I had this experience and I found myself thinking this way and I'm not sure why.
At the beginning of the podcast, we told our listeners that we would discuss all the important things about Lifeline. Is there something that you wish everyone knew about Lifeline or maybe mental health, but for some reason they don't actually have a grasp of it?
Lifeline is, I'm going to say, in community, for community, and with community. And I mean by that, all of our team play a role. All of our team play a role together. So we're in community. We're for community. We're not making widgets. We are there to provide a support for community. And we can't do it without others. We are not the answer to everything. 60% of people who call into Lifeline, we provide a referral on to some other support, which might be to another Lifeline centre or counselling, but it's often other services in the community. So I think that's at the heart of our service. And I think if there's a PS, one thing I'd love, and I think this is particularly relevant, given that some people might listen to this as they're leading into Christmas, I think. And again, I'm going to quote Graham Long, who I think, he said something really profound to me that I think is really important. And he said, the best present, PRESENT, the best present or gift we can give someone at Christmas is probably our presence. There's a lot of gifts that can happen at this time of year, and that's great. I don't begrudge that. I think it's an important, particularly this year, truly being present to somebody at this time of the year. No matter what we've all been through, I think is probably the greatest gift we can give.
Again, I'd like to thank our very special guest, Robert Sams, Executive Director and Volunteer Crisis Supporter at Lifeline Australia, for sharing with us what drives him to have a heart to care for others. If you've enjoyed this podcast or something has resonated with you, could I ask you to share it with some friends? Leave a Facebook or an Apple podcast review and connect us through our social media platforms. If anything that was shared today has caused you any distress, we encourage you, please reach out to Lifeline. Their telephone number is 131114. I'd like to thank our audience for listening, and my thanks to Executive Producer Michael Smith. I am your host, Pietro Di Girolamo, and this has been another episode of Community Conversations. Until next time, Merry Christmas and be kind to each other.